Hello everyone and welcome to another casual review. Today I'm talking about Final Fantasy VIII Remastered. For what it's worth, I never played the original and I played this one on the Nintendo Switch. I'm not sure what has been added or changed from the original aside from the graphics. I've played and finished a fair amount of Final Fantasy games. This one was riding off of the coattails of the masterpiece, at least in terms of gaming culture, that is Final Fantasy VII, and so it had a lot of expectations to meet, which if you ask most Final Fantasy players, they will tell you that it did not. As far as Final Fantasy games go, this is one of the more controversial games, and I think that the creators of this game took a lot of liberties and chances and really mixed up the RPG formula, and I don't think it resonated with as many people as they may have hoped. We'll get into the combat system in just a little bit, but first let's set up the whole world here, because similar to Final Fantasy VII, this takes more of a science fiction fantasy rather than like a medieval high fantasy setting. So you're gonna have the spaceships and the gun laser beams. That's not to say that there's not any swords. It wouldn't be a Final Fantasy game without swords. You play as main character Squall, and he wields a sword and a gun called the Gun Blade. Now, my introduction to Squall, along with most of the Final Fantasy VII and VIII characters, would be through Kingdom Hearts, and that game introduced Squall as Leon, and so that's what I knew him as. And I think at one point in Kingdom Hearts, one of the characters, I think it was Yuffie, called Leon Squall in that game as well, and I never really got why she called him that. I guess now I know. For some reason in Final Fantasy VIII his name is Squall, but in Kingdom Hearts they want to call him Leon. This happened a lot of times actually when I was playing through this game, and I would recognize certain characters that I saw in Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. For instance, Cypher and his gang from Kingdom Hearts 2, and Selphie from Destiny Island. Which is funny, I wonder if there's any characters from Final Fantasy IX in Kingdom Hearts. I really just thought these were original characters. Anyway, we're not here to talk about Kingdom Hearts, we're here to talk about Final Fantasy VIII and playing as Squall. Now, Squall is a seed member at the Garden, and you're like, huh? Well, the Garden, as far as I understand it, is a school to train soldiers, and you'll learn more about the origins of Garden and Seed as you play through the game, but the Garden trains you like a school to become a soldier, and once you're promoted to a soldier, you're like a Seed member, and Seeds are basically like mercenaries. They do have a little more political game in the whole system than like a regular mercenary would though, so they definitely pick and choose who they want their clients to be. Now, Squall is super edgelord, maybe even more than Cloud was in Final Fantasy VII. He doesn't talk a lot. Oftentimes we read his inner dialogue through parentheses as he's just muttering to himself, why would he ever rely on anybody? This whole thing is pointless. This whole thing is stupid. And outwardly, his dialogue is mostly ... whatever. Like, the amount of times that Squall says whatever in this game, it's kind of become a meme at this point. He's just king of whatever. Now, obviously, as he progresses through the game, he learns the value of friendship and falls in love. But yeah, for most of the game, he's pretty edgy. I could imagine a lot of 14, 15-year-olds thinking he's super cool. And as you're playing through the game, Squall and his friends will very frequently fall into a dreamlike state and experience life as others, mostly a man named Laguna. And what's funny about this is I actually found Laguna to be a much more likable character compared to Squall. He's kind of goofy. He always says what's on his mind. He's just kind of a good person, and this really counteracts the whatever emo that is Squall. This time around, the main antagonist of this game is the Sorceress, and it gets a little more complicated in terms of who exactly the Sorceress is. I'm not going to drop any spoilers here, but the Sorceress really isn't necessarily like one kind of entity, if that makes sense. You're not going to be often confronting this antagonist like Cloud did with Sephiroth. I mean, the Sorceress in concept is a cool idea for a character, but yeah, she's certainly no Sephiroth. And that's kind of the case for the main protagonists in this game as well. You get a party of 6 different characters, but not a lot of them really stood out in my mind, like the cast of Final Fantasy VII 7 did. And I'm totally willing to admit, maybe this is just because I didn't spend enough time exploring in the world and doing all these side quests. I kind of was just going for the main objective here. And so maybe a lot of the characters are presented through all of this side content, and that's how you're really supposed to get to know them and start to appreciate them. But the main story is mostly going to focus around Squall and his love interest, Renoa. Now, let's get into the most controversial part about this game, and that being the whole combat system and the junction system. Combat-wise works pretty similar to Final Fantasy VII would. It's an ATB, which means active time battle. That means that each character has a little meter that will slowly fill up, and once the meter is full, then you can initiate your attack. This does not mean that the enemies will wait for you to attack before they attack. If you just let the combat run, then the enemies will consistently attack you. So you really need to choose what you're going to do quickly, because you're kind of wasting potential attacking time here. There's two different options for the ATB. One is wait and one is active. I think wait gives you a little bit more of a grace period in terms of letting you have time to choose what you want to do as far as your turn goes, but the enemies will definitely still keep attacking you if you take a long time. You can toggle on 4 different commands for each character. Well, 3 different, because attack takes one of them. So you're gonna have attack, and then you can either toggle on magic, GF, draw, or item. And so one of those commands is going to have to take the backseat here. Now you may be wondering, what is GF? Well, I don't think they ever actually explicitly tell you what GF stands for. I think it stands for Guardian Force, but these kind of act like summons that you equip to your character. Pretty early into the game, you are given 2 or 3 different GFs, just because they play such a crucial role in the combat system, and ideally, you could actually summon these GFs as many times as you want, because there isn't a mana resource system here. And so on the surface, you can just summon your GFs to do a big, strong magical attack as many times as you want, and you can use spells as many times as you want, with a caveat, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So you may be wondering, why don't you just constantly summon those GFs and do those big, crazy spells as many times as you want, just like I did at the very beginning of the game. And you can get by most of the game through this GF spamming kind of system. One of the main drawbacks that I had with this is watching the GF summon every single time can be quite time consuming. Now the Switch version, this Final Fantasy Remastered, I'm not sure if it is unique to the Switch version or not, but it allows you to toggle on 3 times the speed. So even at 3 times the speed, watching the same GF summon every single time you want to attack does get rather tedious. There are certain occasions where GFs will not help you at all. The main one that comes to mind is the final boss. So you don't want to completely rely on GFs throughout the entire game, because they will be completely useless for the final boss. And really though, halfway through the game, if you know how to junction your characters correctly, your GFs aren't going to do nearly as much damage as your basic attacks will anyway. So now you're wondering, what is the junction system? Well, the junction system is really the most divisive part about this game. Remember how I said that you can equip GFs to your character? Now you can equip multiple GFs to your character, and I'm trying really hard to explain this as simply as possible, so bear with me here, but the idea is you can equip GFs to each character, commands, and you can also equip magic to your stats. So if you have a lot of this really strong magic and you equipped it to your attack stat, suddenly your attacks are going to do a lot more damage. The main means that you will be collecting your magic is through one of the commands called draw, and basically whenever you encounter an enemy, you have the option to draw their magic. Now their magic resources are infinite, and you can draw enemies as many times as you want, as long as you can survive their attacks. Each character can hold 100 of each magic, and so if I encounter an enemy who can cast the spell Fira, then I can draw that Fira until I have 100 of that Fira, and then attach that Fira through the junction system to my attack stat or defense stat or spirit stat or whatever. The cool thing about this is you can actually attach different elements to your attack or status effects to your attack, so every time you attack an enemy, you are also inflicting them with that magical element or that status effect. It can actually get pretty cheap if you know what you're doing, and if you can junction your characters correctly, this will carry you heavily through most of the game. A really cool status effect that I like to attach is the spell Pain. So if I have 100 Pain and I equip that to the status effect, every time I attack an enemy, then I will inflict them with Pain, which I believe it poisons them, silences them, and blinds them. And this is a 100% chance of doing so, unless of course they're immune to that status. Now, if your eyes haven't glazed over already, you can also equip magic to your defense. And so if I want to be immune to those status effects like Pain, then I would equip Pain in my defensive slot. And if I have 100, then I'm 100% defended from that status effect. This also works for elements. And so if I want to equip 100 Fire-Agas on my defensive stat, if I get hit by a fire spell, then I will actually be healed by the fire spell and absorb it rather than take damage from it. This can be especially beneficial going into a boss if you're like following a walkthrough and you learn the type of spells that the boss will use. Just equip those elements in your defensive stat and suddenly the boss is just going to constantly heal you rather than damage you. It's actually a cool system in terms of really customizing your character and building them exactly how you want them to be depending on the situation. The execution, however, is quite tedious. For one, drawing magic over and over again takes a very long time. Now, every time you use the draw command, you'll get anywhere between like 1 and 9 different magic. And so it's not like you have each character has to draw the enemy 100 times for every single spell, but still, it is quite tedious. If you ever do encounter a new enemy, you have to go to the draw and you have to see if they have any magic that you don't potentially have. I mean, you don't have to, but if you want to fully optimize your character with the best possible magic, then it's probably in your best interest just to check if they have any really powerful spells like Holy or Quake or Ultima, Flare. Like, you want to constantly check enemies if they have the really strong spells, because if you equip those strong spells to your character, you're going to do a ton of damage. By the end of the game, Squall was potentially doing anywhere between like 5,000 to 9,999 damage just with his basic attacks, and you can quickly see why this would be more beneficial than just spamming the GF summon over and over again. Granted, the whole draw grinding system is a lot more manageable in this Final Fantasy VIII Remastered because I can toggle on that 3 times speed, which vastly reduces the amount of time that I have to spend doing this. Your GFs can also level up and learn new abilities that you can attach to your command slot to replace one of those 3 different options. And some of the GFs abilities that you slowly unlock allow you to transform items into magic as well. If you don't want to spend all that time drawing enemies, just hope you get the right items and then you can turn them into the strong flares or ultimas or holies or whatever. Whew, so yeah, it is pretty complicated in terms of the junction system, and I feel like if you give this game a chance, I would definitely recommend watching a YouTube video that explains this whole system a lot better than I did. I think this is the major thing that turned people off to the game when they first started joining in. It's definitely a lot more complicated than the materia system in Final Fantasy VII, but if you do it properly, you just become a powerhouse. And for the majority of the game, I felt like this was pretty easy because I was taking down bosses in just a couple of turns just based on the vast amount of damage that I was knocking out on these guys. And I mean, the GF summons, while they are tedious, whenever you do get a new GF summon, it is kind of cool to watch them do this over-the-top crazy animation for the first time. And some of them actually are pretty useful, like they'll cast Repel on all of your party. The limit break in this game is a system that I definitely think didn't need to be changed from Final Fantasy VII. From what I remember, how limits worked in Final Fantasy VII, it's been about a year at this point, but it's basically just like a meter that will slowly fill up as you are in combat, and then once that meter's full, then you can do like a super strong attack. attack. In this game, it's kind of more of a chance of proccing to allow you to use it, but if you're full health, you're probably never going to have the opportunity to use this limit, because the less health that you have, the less percentage that you have in your HP pool, the more likely you are to be able to use your limit. And so you're kind of punished in a way if you keep your characters all full health, because then you never get to use those strong limit attacks. And I really like these limit attacks because the animations on these are super cool, and they have like these button timing presses that you have to utilize, similar to something like Paper Mario, where like if you're playing a Squall and you use your limit, then you have to press the shoulder button at the right time to maximize your damage. Or if you're playing as the martial artist Zell, you have to input the correct commands to maximize your output. And so they were cool. It's just I never really got to see them because more often than not, my party was at full health. And you're actually discouraged in terms of using your magic, because if you do use your magic spells, then you're kind of taking away from your stats, assuming that you have the strong magic attached to your character through the junction system. So yeah, combat, to say the least, is a little wonky, but if you really understand it, then it can be really rewarding. I felt like I spent a decent chunk of this game just customizing my characters in terms of the junction system and creating a build. In terms of leveling up, you're actually discouraged to do that as well, because I've complained about this in many other games, but enemies actually scale with you, and maybe even to the point where they scale higher than you. And so if you get to the end of the game and you're level 99, which is the max, then you're going to have a more difficult time than if you got to the end of the game and you're level 50. Really, your main source of damage and strength is going to come from leveling up your GF's abilities and equipping the proper junction system. So it's like, no, you're actually not required to do grinding in the traditional sense, but you are required to do grinding in terms of the junction system and gathering up all of the magic through this whole draw command. Now, you are given 6 party members in this game, but you can only use 3 of them in the actual combat. Oftentimes throughout the game, you are required to play as certain characters and not allowed to use other characters. And so the character themselves, I didn't really care too much about in terms of leveling them up in stats. What really mattered was the junction loadout that I would perfectly tailor, and then I would swap that loadout between characters. And luckily enough, it does give you the ability to automatically transfer your whole junction loadout to each character. I just found this a lot easier than trying to create 6 different loadouts. I would just create the 3 loadouts and then transfer them to the 3 characters that I'm required to play as. And because enemies will scale up to your level, I would often carry the 3 lowest party members if possible with me. Most of the time you are required to play as Squall, and so Squall, I think by the end of the game, was level 53, and all the rest of the characters were about level 30. That brings me to another really high point about the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster is not only do you have the ability to triple the speed of the game, you also have the ability to completely turn off enemy encounters, which is extremely beneficial because the encounter rate in this game is so high. I actually really want to turn off all the encounters if I was still looking for magic or if I was playing a new area. But sometimes you're just like exploring a dungeon or something like that, and it's just like every 3 steps you're going to encounter an enemy. It became quite tedious. Now, if you are playing the original version of this game, there is an ability that one of the GFs have that completely eliminate the encounter rates if you want to go the proper route rather than just toggling it on and off through the game. Like a lot of Final Fantasy games, the first half of this game is actually fairly linear. You have a set destination, go here, do the thing, and then return back to the garden. And then as you are playing through the game, they slowly start loosening the reins and giving you more exploration in terms of like what kind of vehicles you have access to. I didn't spend too much time exploring. There's a lot of GFs I know that I could potentially unlock, but yeah, I did just kind of go through the main quest line here. Sometimes when you're actually exploring an area in these set pieces, it's a little difficult to know like where you're supposed to go next. Some of the exits and entrances to the rooms and the hallways are fairly hidden, and so I would just be wandering around in a room like, where do I go next, until I finally bump into that spot in the wall that's actually an opening to the next room or whatever. This is not anything new to Final Fantasy VIII. 8. This is pretty common in most of these type of games in PlayStation 1 with like the pre-generated graphics. Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil come to mind. Now, I actually really do like these pre-generated graphics. It's kind of a timepiece at this point because you don't really see these types of graphics anymore because you don't need the pre-generated graphics, but there's a certain charm. It's almost like you're walking through a painting. And this game does a really good job seamlessly transferring between like a really cool cinematic and then actual gameplay, a lot better than it did in Final Fantasy VII. And the cinematics in this game are actually still pretty cool. Now, in the remaster version, the cinematics definitely hold up, but I'm kind of a sucker as far as Final Fantasy cinematics go. It's a very talky game. You're going to be reading a ton of dialogue. Oftentimes before you commit to an operation as a seed member, you have to explain the plan and what exactly you guys are going to do, almost like you're planning a casino heist or something like that. You have to go through every little detail of the plan before it's executed. And sometimes in the game, I'm like, oh, okay, dude, just let me play the game. I just want to go fight monsters. I don't need to know the step-by-step game plan. Oftentimes, it's not really too important in terms of the actual gameplay itself. I mean, sometimes you do play like a little mini game or something, and you need to hear the instructions on how to play said mini game. But as far as like the story goes, I don't need to hear the note for no operation plan. If you need a break from listening to plans or fighting off monsters, this game introduces a card game called Triple Triad. How I understand it, it's basically like King of Cards in terms of like you can just challenge pretty much anyone in the game to a round of Triple Triad. And as far as the gameplay goes for Triple Triad, it looks similar to the game mode in Shovel Knight King of Cards. I gotta be totally honest here, I did not play one game of Triple Triad. I'm just not like interested. Like whenever I play games like this that have this whole extra card system to play, I'm just like, I just want to play the main game. This was the case for games like Witcher 3. Like, I don't want to play Gwent, I just want to play Witcher 3. I guess it is kind of cool that you can challenge practically any character in the game to a match of Triple Triad. And it is kind of a cool concept that as you play through the game, you can acquire new cards that are more and more powerful, and they introduce new rules for Triple Triad. But I really don't have too much to say about it because I never played a match of it. I just didn't care to. The game was originally broken up by 4 discs, and usually by the end of each disc, there's like a big twist or cliffhanger or some big cataclysmic event. I'm glad that I don't have to transfer each disc every time I reach that moment like the olden days though. If you don't believe me that I just streamlined the game and went through all of the main quests without doing much side stuff, let me tell you a little bit of statistics in terms of howlongtobeat.com. Now, howlongtobeat.com states that this game should take maybe 55 hours as far as the original goes. The remastered, much less so. I think the remastered says that it takes maybe 30 some odd hours to play through it. My in-game timer said that this game took me 22 hours to beat. Now, I do imagine that it took me a little longer than that to actually play through. Mostly because of the final boss gave me trouble. It took me about 2 hours to finally take her down, and I don't think the game necessarily tracks that when I get a game over and have to boot the game back up again. So yeah, maybe like 25 hours tops. I never felt underleveled or underprepared for pretty much any encounter besides the very final boss, and that's just due to classic last boss RPG shenanigans, like no matter what, dropping all your health down to 1 hit point and then hitting you with a mass spell that kills you. I could go on and on about the final boss of this game, but you can just see for yourself. I'm very conflicted in terms of my final thoughts about this game. I didn't like having to draw all the magic from all the enemies and hunting down all the magic, but I really actually did like customizing my character and to build my party into the powerhouses that they ended up being. I liked that I didn't have to grind into this game, but also it made most of my victories against enemies quite meaningless. Like in terms of when I defeat a final boss and it says 0 XP gained, yeah, it's cool that I'm not leveling up because I don't want to face off against really strong enemies later in the game, but also it is kind of deflating when I defeated a boss and I don't see any level ups, like I would in a more traditional RPG. I always love the world building of Final Fantasy games. That's probably the main highlight when playing through them in terms of their unique designs and architecture and weapons and monsters. The music is also top-notch, just like pretty much any Final Fantasy game. But as far as the story goes, mixed feelings about the story too. But to be honest, I've never been like completely enthralled by any Final Fantasy game's story. Well, that's not true. Final Fantasy X really does hit me, but that's probably because that was the first one that I ever played through. I guess my final thoughts are, like any Final Fantasy game, I didn't have a complete blast playing through it all the time. Sometimes playing through the game did feel a little tedious, but I'm always glad that I have beaten a Final Fantasy game. It's always a pretty satisfying experience, and looking back on my journey, looking at all the highlights, I'm always glad having played a Final Fantasy game. I'm gonna give this game a 3 out of 5. I don't think that Final Fantasy VIII deserves all the hate that it gets, but to be honest, some of the criticisms about this game are pretty fair. Well guys, that's it for me. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about Final Fantasy VIII or VIII Remastered, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Bye!